I am unlike most of my friends and students in that I think, was born a composer. My first conscious thoughts, I think, were about music and making my own music. And as a child, I loved playing with my little 45 RPM record set, and always wanted to be the guy whose name was on the front of the jacket. So I would make up my own record covers as a 5 or 6 year old. Would sing what I thought were symphonies. I really would love to be able to hear one of those things, but I did go around singing and pretending that what was coming out of my mouth was coming out of the record player. So that went on until we got a piano in the house. My parents were not musicians, but they loved music, and I think that's the great thing about the culture that I grew up in. I think it was a fairly common thing for middle class people to at least know who Beethoven was and to enjoy listening to classical music on the radio. And my dad became a hi-fi buff, so that was my great fortune because he bought lots of recordings of things that would show off his hi-fi. We went to stereo sometime around 1960. That was a big moment in my life too. So we would just, he would buy records. I got to hear all the Beethoven symphonies and got to know things like Firebird and Petrushka, and just loved listening to music, and that was a big part of my life. But I also took piano lessons and studied, went very quickly through a lot of things as a 6-year-old, 7-year-old. I used to take piano lessons with my sister, but to her chagrin, I passed her, even though she was 4 years older than I was. I was raised Catholic and went to a Catholic school, and so a lot of my early devotion to music was tied to religious music. I had this great affinity for choral pieces. I had to listen to every oratorio that Handel had written, and sang in the Catholic church choir. I learned a lot of Gregorian chant. I think I'm also fortunate that I grew up in a period where we still used Latin, and I learned a lot of the Latin liturgy. And that's come on to play a large role in a lot of my music ever since, even though not religious at all these days. But the culture of that music and that kind of intensity carries over into my music. It's funny because I, like many Catholic boys, most of my friends in my class wanted to be a priest. So I held on to my wanting to be a priest longer than most of them. That went all the way through junior high school. And I think that I have some missionary feeling about wanting to give people something and to persuade people with ideas that has sort of transferred from the religious direction into the arts and into particularly in music. So I still feel myself somewhat wanting to convert people to all the music I love, and wanting to somehow give the joy that I'm feeling in music to everyone. So that's kind of a crossover from my religious backgrounds. I think I was fortunate to grow up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is a wonderful city, and it's just maybe the perfect size for someone who wants to have access to a lot of art readily. So I became familiar with the Pittsburgh Symphony by the time I remember, like in third grade, going to Pittsburgh Symphony concerts and coming home and wanting to find out more about the bass clarinet that I had seen. One big moment in my life was the Mozart bicentennial. He was born in 1756, and in 1956, Columbia Record Albums came out with a record of rehearsal, Bruno Walter conducting the Mozart Linz Symphony. And it came with a score. So as a third grader, I was able to look at this score and listen to Bruno Walter rehearsing the Columbia Orchestra. Actually, I found out that that was violating union rules and it never should have gotten out. But I was able to really get very close to the way an orchestra can work from that at a pretty early age. I started thinking about writing symphonies even at that point. But as I said before, my main interest was choral music. Even though as a pianist, I was making great progress as a pianist, but I didn't really have that much interest in instrumental music. It was choral music, writing for, particularly when I went to high school. Our Baldwin High School in Pittsburgh had one of the best choral programs in the state. And at that point, all of the girls in their choir robes were incredibly beautiful, so I had to be attached to that world. And so I was very interested in writing music for that choir. I had also, on the other side, on the piano side, tremendous luck to run into a piano teacher. His name is Ferguson Webster. His brother was a fairly well-known pianist, concert pianist, taught at Juilliard, Beveridge Webster. So Beveridge and Ferguson were sort of Pittsburgh piano stars. But the great thing about this piano teacher was that he taught not so much polishing everything, but actually learning a lot of music. So I, throughout my studies with him, 6 years from junior high school through college, studied a good bit of the well-tempered clavier, all the Bach French suites, English suites, inventions, sinfonias, about 10 Haydn sonatas and 10 Beethoven sonatas, Mozart concertos, Beethoven concertos. But he also, and a lot of Romantic literature, of course, but he also, in the 50s, was very aware of the 20th century music, the great pieces. So I was studying things like the Berg Piano Sonata, which was a major influence in my life in high school, memorizing that piece and playing it over and over again, trying to impress the girls in high school with how I could play this crazy piece. So those kind of things had a big impact. I was able to win a competition to play a Mozart concerto with the Pittsburgh Symphony and when I was in 10th grade. So I had that great opportunities. And also when I would go out to study with my piano teacher, he lived in Squirrel Hill, a part of town which was the cultural center and which housed the Carnegie Library, the main Carnegie Museum and Library in Pittsburgh, which is, and by the way, it is Carnegie. Pittsburghers know that. But at this library, they had a tremendous collection of recordings and scores. And so my weekly drill would be to go to my piano lesson and then go to Carnegie Library and check out a bunch of scores, check out the latest recording of a Handel oratorio or some Bach cantata. Much to my piano teacher's chagrin, I was not listening to a lot of piano music, But I think that helped to have the two things going in different directions. So that was a tremendous time of growth and creation for me, and wrote some choral pieces in high school that I'm still very proud of, still get performed. Uh, Wrote a couple piano pieces that I'm still kind of fond of. So at that point, graduating from high school, had to decide where to go from there. Of course, my wonderful piano teacher, Ferguson Webster, didn't want me to leave him and was trying to work out some way to continue studying with him. But I had a great scholarship offer from the local Pittsburgh College, Duquesne University, which had a very good music program and a wonderful composition teacher, Joseph Wilcox Jenkins, who then became my mentor for my 4 years of undergraduate study at Duquesne University. And there I wrote a lot of instrumental music, string quartets, woodwind trios, orchestra pieces, songs, and was very filled with lots of great musicians. I also met my wife there. I wrote some songs for her. It was interesting that and one of my friends at Duquesne was David Liptak, who has been the chair of the Eastman School of Music. So at one point, as little known perhaps as Duquesne University Music School might be, at one point in history, the chair of the Indiana University Composition Department and the Eastman School of Music Composition Department were both graduates of the composition program at Duquesne. After graduating from Duquesne University with my Bachelor of Music in 1969, that was the period of the Vietnam War and the end of the 60s, and a real crazy period in our country, perhaps in the world at large. And a troubling period for a young man trying to determine how to choose what to do with your life, because if I chose graduate school over looking for some sort of employment that might have given me a deferment, I was in the pecking order to be drafted. So I had pretty much made up my mind I was going to just go ahead and take a little job at Hart College that was offered to me that I could actually use as a deferment teaching job. But the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York, offered me what they called a National Defense Education Act scholarship. And that paid for all of my graduate study as well as a stipend on top of that. So I took my new wife. We got married just as soon as we both graduated from high school. Convinced her to turn down the sweet job that she had lined up in Hartford and to move to snowy, cold Rochester to spend 3 years studying at the Eastman School of Music. And that, of course, maybe is the most important, most intense study of composition in my life. Continued as my piano studies there, but mostly excited about what I learned there as a composer and the opportunities I had to write large orchestral and wind ensemble works, work with some really fabulous musicians, to meet some people who have been a part of my musical life ever since. I studied with some great teachers there. I would probably have to mention Samuel Adler as my mentor. He's the one who I finished my studies with, and it's stayed my sort of guiding spirit in composition to this day. Just saw him earlier this year. So with Adler's help and with the help of a lot of my colleagues and the situation and a fabulous place to learn music, earned a doctorate in 3 years, was finished at the age of 24 with my doctorate and looking for a job. And at that time, that was 1972 then, I managed to avoid the draft in that story. There was a very long story that goes as to how I avoided the draft, but it all boils down to my eyesight being just bad enough to not have to go and kill people in Vietnam. So I was able to complete my doctoral study in 3 years and was looking for a job. Was delighted to have a few options and chose the one that seemed the best, which was Memphis State University in Memphis, Tennessee. So my wife Sandra and I set out on a new life in the South and spent 20 years in Memphis and took in a lot of influences there. I should mention that I haven't said too much about the kind of music I loved or was interested in, but one thing that was a very big thing for me in high school, playing in a rock band, throughout college, playing with the jazz groups and some rock bands in college, was the music of the Beatles especially. I loved all pop music, and I always wanted to figure out some way to include that music that I love, along with the Bach and the Bartok and the Stravinsky, that was major influence in my classical art music language. So all the time in my life, I've always been writing sort of rock and roll oriented music. One of my experiences at Eastman was winning the Hanson Prize for a piano concerto that I wrote. Howard Hanson, famous American composer, was still very influential, though not on the faculty at Eastman at that time. And every year he would choose a piece from our orchestral reading sessions to program on his American Music Festival. He wouldn't choose it, the faculty would choose it, but he had veto power, and when he heard that the faculty had chosen this piece that had rock and roll in it, he vetoed it. So one of my glorious moments that was to come, having my piece performed, was scuttled by the fact that I just had a little too much rock and roll in my blood. But that's not something I'm ever ashamed of. I want to find as many ways of incorporating all the things that I'm in love with in all the music I write. Taking a new job at Memphis was living as far away from home as I'd ever been, in a very different kind of culture. And I think that's a very enriching experience. And there were many, many fine things at Memphis. One of the things that strikes me, though, as I look back on those years, is that unlike Eastman, where I had gotten my doctorate, or Indiana University, where I am right now, there wasn't enough going on in music maybe to satisfy my hunger for all the things I wanted to be involved with. But I was very close then at that point. We were right next door to the theater department. Also on the other side was the art department. So much of my time in Memphis was involved working with people in the theater, and also writing pieces that were inspired by artworks. I moved from teaching about 3 composition students when I got there to finally ending up with pretty much a whole load of 12 to 15 composition students. The department had grown. People were interested in coming to study with me. I had people from very interesting places, including Brenton Broadstock, who in the around 1980 period came and studied composition with me. Had some really fine students who are actually still out there doing great things. And as time progressed, I had more and more advanced students. We started a doctoral program. So that made me more challenged as a teacher to find ways of dealing with many different kinds of students and to find what was lighting their fire, and how I could help them grow as creative musicians and composers. Some of the big things that happened to me in Memphis, Actually, there are two names I should really mention because I wrote a lot of music for them. One was Alan Rippey, the saxophone professor, and he's still in Memphis right now, who came and just completely gave me a kind of kindred spirit to write music for. He would play anything and try anything and play it with a kind of audacious courageousness that all composers are looking for. So from the time of meeting Alan, I've been sort of a saxophone composer, and that's to this day one of my most fertile area for writing and for getting performances. And the other person that was very influential was a violinist, Julian Ross, also someone who wanted to be challenged and have new music written for them, and also is someone who to this day is still playing my music a lot and has given me lots of inspiration. Even after leaving Memphis, I went on to write concertos for him. So maybe the most remarkable experience I had in Memphis was conducting the orchestra. I'm not sure I was the greatest orchestral conductor ever, but for me it was a great experience to learn and to work with the young musicians and to look at scores from the standpoint of how a conductor and an orchestra of competent musicians would have to struggle to put pieces together. In my connection with the orchestra and with the theater department, I wrote the biggest piece of my life, which is a work called Passion with Tropes. And that was designed to bring together all of my Catholic leanings, my love of voice, my love of theater, my love of choral music, and deep thoughts about what religion means to life when it's viewed in a secular way. And that piece still remains perhaps my testament in terms of a large multimedia theater piece. There are a couple of important things about what I did at Memphis State that I haven't mentioned so far. One was when I got there, I had had some experience back at Eastman with a student composers symposium, bringing together people from different universities. And I thought perhaps in that part of the country, it would be a good idea to have some sort of regional composers enclave. And then suddenly it seemed like, why worry about regional? So, and why worry about students? I think a lot of composers around the world are looking for opportunities to have their music presented. So in 1974, I began at Memphis State University a new music festival. At that point, there weren't so many of those kind of things. So it was a fantastic opportunity for a lot of composers to come. I had a tremendous appetite for looking at music. I still do. I love um, examining, reviewing scores, and choosing pieces and seeing how I could bring them to life. So we would do something like 100 pieces every year, bringing in composers. I got to perform a lot of them with the composers. It became sort of a well-known national event, and that's certainly one way that I got familiar with the guest composers we would bring in. Certainly, a lot of people became familiar with me, so it was a wonderful way to sort of make some sort of impression on the music world. Um, so that was something that actually I think it's still going in some state in Memphis. The original sort of design I had for it lasted for I think something like 13 years. So it was a wonderful part of my life and something that it was great that I could do that in a place like Memphis and have the performers there encounter not just new music but composers of new music and work with composers on their pieces, which is something that I think the world needs more than anything else. I think composers have something to give that composers, the performers who are not actively working with live composers on realizing what the composer's looking for, don't really know how to play Bach or Beethoven because they don't know what drives great composers or even very good composers to write music. Another thing that happened in Memphis too that I haven't mentioned is a close relationship with the Casio synthesizer, which became a big influence on the way I thought about music, writing sort of useful, maybe even kind of party music that would work very well in all sorts of environments. The great thing about being a pianist, the great thing about the Casio is it freed me from what pianists are always trapped by, that you have this enormous instrument you can't carry around. But I could take the Casio anywhere, and we had a group of 4 players. I mentioned already Alan Rippey and Julian Ross. A third person I really need to mention is Robert Patterson, horn player, and also a great composer. And Robert wrote a lot of music for our ensemble. I wrote a lot of music for it, and we played music for art galleries, music for dance programs, and that kind of relationship and feeling that kind of musical experience was something that could have been certainly a highlight to my creative thinking in the years of the 80s. I actually only applied for one job while I was in Memphis. I think I was very happy being there for 20 years and wasn't really looking to get out. But I had made some friends with faculty at the Indiana University School of Music. Claude Baker actually was my friend from Eastman, one of those people I mentioned at Eastman that have been my friend in my support artistically throughout my life. Claude was on the faculty here, Fred Fox was on the faculty here, and so when they had an opening in 1992, somehow I made it on their invite to interview list. I guess I did a good enough job with the interview to convince them that they wanted me. So in 1992, I left Memphis to begin a career teaching at Indiana University. Well, I should mention that on the way to Indiana, I went by way of Melbourne. It was a great transition because teaching at the University of Melbourne, thanks to Brenton Broadstock and the McGeorge Fellowship offered by Melbourne University, I was able to have an experience in a different kind of world, maybe a little more intense kind of world than what I had in Memphis. It sort of set me up for my experience at Indiana University, and also enabled me to learn a fabulous country. Australia is still a very, very deep in my heart and my wife's heart. And we always talk about it. We have to get back there all the time. So that was a period of trying something new, coming to a new place. And the first thing I noticed about being here was the quality of the students was so outstanding, but also the respect that the students had and the eagerness the students had to learn something from you. It's a kind of conundrum, I think, that you might think that the better students are, the less respect they might have for you because they themselves are possibly writing better music than you could write. But it's quite the opposite. It seems the better students are the ones who take the most from what the professor has to offer. And that's been a consistent delight to me. I've been here almost 24 years teaching at Indiana. And that entire period has just been marked with years and years and years of daily seeing brilliant young people coming in and showing me their ideas, and my trying to somehow impart some of the things I've learned about getting the most out of yourself as a composer to them. As I hope most of the world knows, the Indiana University School of Music, now known as the Jacobs School of Music, is one of the largest and highest level conservatories in the world. So being in a place that has 5 orchestras, 4 wind ensembles, multiple choruses, does 6 professionally level produced operas a year, and perhaps most important for me, an incredible new music ensemble. Being able to have works performed by these groups has been a dream. I mean, this is a composer dying and go to heaven. When I came to Indiana, I had that feeling, and I'm very happy to report that I still have that feeling. The orchestras have played a number of my pieces. Practically anything I've been able to write over the last 20 years has been performed here in definitive performances. Choral writing has been wonderfully supported here and continues to get better and better all the time. It's at a peak right now that I think is beyond belief how good the level of our best choruses are. So I've had lots of cushions and chance to work with them. My biggest maybe memories are the larger kind of events. So writing a full scale ballet to Flaubert's Madame Bovary. most exciting things I've worked with is taking this piece that was conceived in Memphis with the theater and actually bridging some of the gaps I've felt in my life here with the theater department to construct what is called an immersive theater approach to producing that piece. So the piece that involves orchestra with a little jazz ensemble inside of it, several soloists, chorus, dancers, actors, and very elaborate video and lighting effects, all brought together to create a sort of a new kind of concept. So the Passion with Tropes, a performance from 2011, a piece that had been around for, in one way or another, for about 30 years, finally became this very special, very satisfying experience. I mentioned earlier the New Music Ensemble, and that's my sort of go-to way to write. I think that this ensemble of 14 to maybe 20 players, everyone involved as a soloist, I think it's nature's perfect kind of ensemble. You have all the glories of all the different kinds of instrumental sounds, but you also have the individual character of each instrumentalist participating in ways that even the best orchestras seem not ever to reach that level of total commitment that one has to have to play in an ensemble like that. One of the great perks of being a university professor is we are provided with sabbatical leave every 7 years, and I determined to make that a study of the world in a way, so that my first sabbatical in '98 was a trip to Europe. Being from Indiana University is a great calling card to allow yourself the opportunity to visit many conservatories throughout the continent and catch up with friends who have been hired there. So in '98, went through Europe doing concerts and lectures. In 2005, my next sabbatical, we decided to use Asia as our destination point. Again, based on many of the connections I have through the university, I was able to have tremendous relationships with composers and university faculty throughout Asia, Japan, China, Korea, Taiwan, even ended up in Thailand. And then the last sabbatical I had was in 2012, and that was the most recent, so it's still fresh in my mind, how tremendously exciting and inject so much energy into me was this trip to South America, where I was able to, again, using the contacts and the former students and the sort of the prestige of my position at Indiana here, to visit several South American countries, teach master classes, meet some incredibly wonderful faculty and students. Just so impressed with the energy and the musicality and joyfulness that pervades the whole continent of South America. The thing that excites me most about music is the way it becomes a part of the listener. I've been reading a lot of new research on how the brain processes the musical experience, what things come into play as a listener is listening to music, and it's so important to understand that the role music plays in forming growth and structure of the brain, and how, as composers, I think we have an obligation to be considering that that we are actually creating the kinds of minds that our listeners are carrying around with them. And so we have to ask ourselves, what is it that we really want to contribute to the way people look at the world? So I'm not interested in just creating a pleasant experience for a listener. It has to be an experience that they will need to remember and want to remember. Because I think that there's something about the way that music works that no other art form invokes, that to even enjoy a phrase of music, your memory has to be engaged. You've got to be comparing things that are happening now with things that happened seconds ago and things that will happen seconds in the future, and that can carry on in large forms over minutes and hours. And this kind of thought process that the music involves is so critical to developing the ability to embrace and deal with the issues that we all have to experience as human beings. So, to translate that into actual musical materials, I'm always looking for musical materials that can have the capacity of being absorbed and sink into the listener. I do want them to walk away singing the tune. And I'm not ashamed to say that as a composer. But I know there's a lot more that I want to give them just a tune they walk away whistling. So it's trying to find a way to use those materials, other materials which capture their attention, which has some sort of significance, and especially have some sort of memorability, and to structure those things in ways that reward the listener for paying attention. So my hope is that I can create musical structures that are engaging and memorable and rewarding for the listener, and reward those kinds of creativity in their own mind, not just showing how creative a composer can be and what kind of sounds can I come up to impress you with my creativity, but how can I invoke your creativity as a listener? And I think I'm doing that if I can do it in ways that allow you to respond to relationships you see and characters that you experience. And by my way of thinking, all the great music that I love, I spend a lot of time in the world of Bach. It's become a sort of my chosen discipline at the piano to practice and memorize a lot of Bach's Walternklavier, and think about how those things are put together and play them in different keys, and examining the kind of repetition processes that go on. Because I think that's very meaningful for me as a composer, to understand that there is Bach in all of his music, thinking about how I'm going to see things and respond to things creatively that he so richly put in his music. So that's what I value. That's what I want to capture. That's what I want to always be looking for as I listen to different kinds of music, different kinds of techniques that composers can use to put music together. The value of anything that, to me, as a composer, in anything I detect, any kind of technique someone shows me, any kind of sound that I can impart, those things are only valuable to me in to the extent that I can actually use them to allow a performer to get more involved in understanding my thought processes, my creative intention, and then the performer can project that into the brain of the listener, and music takes place in that brain. That's what I think I'm writing for. That's what I'm trying to get my students to think about all the time as they compose. I do think it's important for a composer to think about who they are and what they are contributing to the world and where their sort of language sits in the overall scheme of things. I've tried to think about myself as how could I say, who am I? One glib way I've thought of myself is I'm a post-Gershwin composer. I think Gershwin is an example of a composer who took jazz and pop elements but constructed classical works that I think are still valid or still meaningful. I want to go way beyond that. I want to go way beyond what Bernstein maybe did, what Copland did. But it's still thinking about composers whose language have somehow tried to embrace what they know of the state of the technique of the art at the time they are living, but also want to get deep into the roots of the listener's conscious culture and musical experience. So generally that means basically I will steal any kind of technique I can find. So I'm very happy with using avant-garde techniques in terms of freer notation, or in terms of extended techniques on the instruments, in terms of creating sound masses and colors that will be striking to the listener. But at the same time, I don't want this listener to walk away with only that experience. I also want them to walk away with something tangible and solid and concrete. And much of that in my world comes from my American experience, from the American songbook and the great songs and pop music that I've become familiar with. And so I think combining all these things together is not an easy thing to do. It's not a facile kind of cheesy bringing things together in a haphazard way. It means a deep kind of processing, a deep kind of response, an analysis of all of the materials that a composer chooses to use, and an assembling of them in ways that allow them to resonate against each other in a way that is very deep and will continue to be meaningful once the little blush of hearing odd things put together might pass. I have a great belief in the importance of composition. I think composers are the most significant musicians around. Being a pianist and a performer, I have heard a lot of sympathize with the other side of that argument, but I really think that composers, at least as far as Western art music is concerned, are the past and the present and the future of music. And being able to deal with young composers as they struggle with the issues of how to create something is a constant source of engagement and joy for me, and certainly a stimulation to my own thinking as I go about my own pieces. My approach to teaching composition is to try to give the young composers as many different ways of thinking about issues that composers face, so that they can deal with problems in a multifaceted way. Some of the ways to get to that are to limit the issues so that they can really focus on particular responses to particular issues. So having someone write a piece for just 2 wood blocks, or a piece for using just 2 pitch classes, or using a particular chord. These things are sort of traditional. It's not my own invention, but something I rely on a lot in composition classes to get students going. I think sketching is a really important part of the composition process. So it's something that I spend a lot of time in lessons trying to engage students in thinking about different ways they can organize their thoughts, from the very thought process of just getting good ideas. I think sometimes we start out as composers just with the first idea that comes to us, instead of digging deeper into our resources, our creativity, to find different ideas, a collection of ideas, and also a collection of ideas about ideas. Because I think that the main beauty of composed music is it allows composers to create a whole matrix of related ideas and ideas about those ideas, and that's where the really most interesting part of music making is to me. And to me, I believe also the most emotionally involving and substantial contributions that music makes to our entire way of thinking and looking at the world. I like to use models to look at great compositions and see how other composers solve these issues. One reason I think it's so important for composers to be active and appreciated in today's music world is that any kind of performance a performer gives, if it's composed music, is essentially a realization of something composer created, not just the product, but the process a composer goes through to write a piece. So I think if you're playing a work by Bach, you shouldn't treat it like some sort of holy scripture that every word came from God, but rather as a process, as a composer who has ideas, has to make decisions about these ideas, has to put these ideas together in a particular order and choose from a variety of possible solutions. And if you're engaged in that much more alive kind of world as a performer, then I think you'll appreciate more about the essence of how a piece of music actually operates. So I've spent a lot of my time studying Bach and using Bach as a sort of a reference point for what kinds of techniques composers, even using today's styles and attitudes, can still involve in their music. So some of the things is, the first point I make in my talking about Bach is that although a lot of people are talking about numerology and some sort of obscure hidden meaning in Bach's music, I find that the most important thing about Bach's music and any really great music is that what is perceived is the most important thing. That the composer is actually very much aware of a human listening process and builds their structures and their ideas and even creates their material in terms of what is going to be something a listener can hang on to, appreciate, recognize, and eventually be emotionally involved in, take delight in, carry around with them as they lead their lives. So perception is something that sometimes composers get so involved in thinking about the theory behind their music or what it is they're trying to do that they don't ask themselves the most essential question is, what are people going to hear from this? So that's, I think, when I'm looking at Bach, I'm amazed at how he always puts things in places with the right ability to be pronounced. He put the really important stuff in the soprano or the bass when you're getting towards the end of the piece. You don't hide it in the middle. And most important thing about perception, I think, is time, because you can point to all sorts of things that exist perhaps in some piece that you may be writing, but if those things exist but aren't capable of being perceived because there's too much going by, or you've lost the listener's direction, so they aren't particularly listening to the thing that they should be listening to at the time they get there, then basically the piece is not going to succeed in expressing what you as a composer are trying to create. So the great thing about Bach's music, for example, is how he uses various kinds of information control devices to make the timing just right. It's not always how dense and how much I can shove into a particular moment, but when you have those moments, how do you prepare the listener for them to happen? So there are many things that come up. Every composition lesson is a new experience for me. I've been teaching composition for 45 years, and still keep finding in every hour of teaching something fresh and intriguing and needing a creative response. And that creative response, that thing that a composer has to do to come up with a way of looking at something, some issue that's never been looked at in that particular way before, is I think what's exciting about composition and exciting about music as we listen to it. So when people ask me, how do I go about composing? What's the process you go through? One thing that is needs to be recognized is you don't just become a composer when you start writing this particular piece, but you're a composer throughout your life. So every little experience I have, I try to think of it as a composer would think of it. So if I see a beautiful sunset, if I watch a great play, all of those are recorded as ideas that can become part of the next piece. The difference between a professional composer and the average person may be that I am intent on remembering those things and recording them and making sketches, making some sort of commitment to paper of things that seem interesting to me. One of the things I have is a list of titles. Titles kind of inspire me. So every time I hear an interesting phrase, a couple of words that come together in a fascinating way, I'll record that. I'll write it down. So I have a list of like 300 titles. Most of them are a little too silly maybe to use in pieces, but they really do inform me. And if you look at a list of my compositions, you'll see that they're hopefully the titles are somewhat amusing or intriguing. So also musical material. I think we need to have sketchbooks. I have collected my music in lots of different ways. Traditionally, I always kind of had a little notebook of keeping ideas written down. Still have some of that. But I've been more involved lately in going to a sequencer program. And every time I have a great tune, something, some idea, some chord progression, some gesture that I think might be useful sometime in my life, I'll go to the MIDI keyboard, play that into my digital performer program, and I have a list of maybe 200 little snippets of material like that much of it comes to the surface in pieces 10 years, 15 years down the road from when they were first input into that collection. Also, I sometimes like to just record myself playing the piano. It's a different thing entirely than when you're putting something into a MIDI sequencer. Or singing little things into my iPhone and recording those. So when I'm starting on a piece, I usually have this collection of ideas that I look at in relationship to the piece I'm going to be writing. The piece I'm about 80% of the way through, as I'm talking right now, is a work for a quintet, mixed instrumental quintet of flute, clarinet, violin, cello, and piano. So I'm looking for ideas that I think would work well in that medium. And then finding material from my collection, from my list of thoughts about things I've always wanted pieces to do. We'll start collating those, and then taking the 2 or 3 most substantial ones from that collection and spend a lot of time then spinning out material. So my belief about composing is that it's like putting together a documentary film, perhaps, that you get lots of material, you get 200 hours of footage, and then you try to put it into a 10-minute piece. Figuring about the best possibilities, the best, most potential elements to bring together, and particularly how they relate to each other. So it's a long process of looking at lots of different material in different lights and saying, what if I start with this? What if I end with this? Is this a good thing to do in the middle? So I'm a very unsure about how composers begin with measure one, write a fully orchestrated measure one, and keep writing fully orchestrated measures until they get to the end of the piece. That seems like an impossible way of organizing thoughts to me, although composers have written some really good pieces that way. My way of thinking about composition is that it's a construction, it's a design, it's a thing you have to build, and you build it with materials, and then you decide how your materials are going to relate to each other and construct it that way. And that's, again, going back to the works of Bach. I think Bach actually thought that way. There's things that he couldn't possibly have done if he hadn't organized all that material ahead of time. So I've been composing a long time, but I've continually rejuvenated by the thoughts of all the things that still need to be done. I think we as composers have a big obligation to do something for our society and try to figure out what our particular talents can contribute in special ways. So I am always asking myself, am I really writing the kind of music that is going to have the impact that I'd like it to have? I really think that perhaps we're not creating the best quality of art music, of composed music, that we're capable of doing. Certain things get in our way. Sometimes the marketing of music, how people listen to pieces, how it gets out there, has gotten in the road of the music itself. And we basically need to be conscious of how we can write music that will in itself be the marketing. It'll be so good, it'll have so much quality to it that inevitably it's going to be appreciated and loved. So, but one has to consider what things we're not seeing that we would like to see more of. I feel that perhaps too much of the music today has a lot of surface flash to it, but not enough substance beneath that flash. And we have to find ways of having the surface appeal that I think all great music has, but beneath that surface have great substance. And how we can incorporate different approaches to our media that will invoke that kind of depth in the response. So I'm looking for ways to do that, and every time I have an opportunity to write a new piece, I'll try to find something about this medium that hasn't been used to the point that I want to use it. If I'm writing a marimba piece, I've heard lots of really great, wonderful marimba pieces, but I'm asking myself what hasn't been done yet. So my latest marimba piece was inspired by listening to a Bushman recording of Mbira and trying to use the different kinds of qualities of sounds that come from that in the use of the marimba, working together with the marimbas to find different kinds of mallets, different kind of approaches to the instrument. So I'm always excited to think of the future of how many things there are like that we can find just new perspective on. I'm most interested, and hopefully I'll have some more opportunity to do that, in working with music theater pieces, because I think that's the area where there is the opportunity to reach the largest kind of audience. People can really understand what's going on in a way that hasn't been really done so well. I'm not very happy with opera. There's something about it that seems a little too stylized to me. Even the kind of singing, especially that goes on in opera. And I'm not particularly fond of most of the new music theater pieces I'm seeing. So my project right now is to keep working on what I've been doing with a version of Romeo and Juliet that is tailored for singing actors. So I'm spending a lot of my time these days working on finding the appropriate kind of sound for that. It has been done with piano and voices. Now I'm working on finding out how can orchestration be approached in a way that's going to be colorful and thoroughly composed the way I love orchestration to sound, and still be serviceable to create the right kind of information, the right kind of color, the right kind of atmosphere that the singers need to perform as actors when they produce that.
Welcome, gentlemen, ladies that have their toes and plagued with corns will walk about with you. What lady is that which doth enrich the hand of yonder knight? Oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright. The measure done, I'll watch her place of stand, and touching hers, make blessed my rude hand. Did my heart love till now forswear its sight? For I ne'er saw true beauty till this night. This, by his voice, should be a Montague. Fetch me my rapier. To strike him dead, I hold it not a sin. Why, how now, kinsmen? Wherefore storm you so? Uncle, this is a Montague. 'Tis he that villain Romeo. Content because, let him alone. I'll not endure him. You'll not endure him. You'll not endure him. You'll make a mutiny among my guests. He shall be endured. Why, uncle, 'tis a shame. Am I the master here, or you? Go to, more light, for shame. I'll make it quiet, but cheerily, my heart.
I like to wrap up my thinking about composition and music in the context of what I think are the three great lies that are holding us back as composers and perhaps as a musical society, because I think we subconsciously buy into these things, even though if you examine it, you can see that they're clearly giving us misinformation. And there's a lot of lies and misinformation that are getting stronger and stronger. So I think we have to be very conscious of fighting these sort of givens or implied circumstances that in reality aren't true at all. One of them is that there is a dichotomy between your brain and your emotions, and that music, which is intellectually interesting, is cold and somehow doesn't do anything, or music which, if you want to create something that's going to have a tremendous dramatic impact, has to be kind of stupid. And I think that's exactly the wrong way of looking at the world and art particularly. I think art actually, by my definition, is when the intelligence, the cognition, the recognition, the understanding of things fires your emotions, and your emotions fire your intellectual comprehension. And if it's simply intelligence, it's just a game, it's just a process. If it's just emotions, it's experience, but it's not art. It only becomes art when those two things come together. And I think we need, as musicians, educators, to more strongly give the people we're working with the realization that the more they understand and appreciate and can grasp what is going on in whatever art they're observing, the deeper their emotional response can be to it. The second great lie is that creativity is some sort of tremendous gift that's given, and some people have it and some people don't. I think that's a lie that holds back our society in a very definite way, that we tend to think that, oh, some people can be creative, let them do the creative thinking. Creativity is actually, it's a skill. It's something that the more you do, the more you can do it well. It's something that has to be practiced regularly, and young people, children, generally are always practicing it. They have to. Their lives is all about creating new things and responding to the things they have creatively. But unless we continue to foster that creativity and find ways to make them think more and more creatively about what they're doing, it's going to become weaker and weaker as a part of their lives, as a part of their makeup as human beings. And so basically, I think our job is to, in our own lives and in the people we're interacting with, to find ways to make creativity an exercise. People are very much now into physical exercise these days. I think it's great. Everybody wants to spend a couple hours at the gym making sure their bodies don't lose their muscle tone. But we need to spend the same amount of time keeping our brains creative in ways that develop our creative thinking tone. And music is a great way to do that, but music needs to be approached with this thought about what are the creative aspects, what makes every little bit of music that we listen to a distinctive element, a flash of idea, and how can we create our own. And I think composition should not be something that's reserved for composers. There's no reason why everybody shouldn't be doing it and can be doing it and can be enjoying it with the same sort of passion and prevalence as playing video games. The third big lie, and I think this is the one I have the most trouble even convincing myself that it's a lie, but it just has to be. And this is that all the great music has been written, and that basically all we can do is little sort of sidebars to the great works of Beethoven and Bach and Tchaikovsky, even Stravinsky. We have to constantly be challenging ourselves with the understanding that it doesn't make any kind of mathematical, psychological, sociological sense to assume that there aren't more talented, more creative, more humanistically dedicated people in the world today than the greats of the past. We're here, the people are out there, and this music that's going to be created in the future is going to make Bach and Beethoven look like great images from the past, but we have our own that's even more exciting and more involving to us because it speaks to us in our own language. We have to be working towards this. We have to be looking for this. We have to be supporting it in any way that we see it, because it is the measure of who we are as human beings and something that we have to be constantly fighting to achieve.